Hello, I'm Stuart Bowes, and you're watching or listening to the Net Hero podcast. This is a podcast for you if you care about what we're doing to the planet. You don't have to be an eco-warrior. We believe business is the solution to making things better. But we're for people who want to make that difference by either cutting their emissions or coming up with ideas that can help us do things a bit better. We've featured politicians, academics, lots and lots of business people, entrepreneurs, inventors, and of course people who are just interested in doing the right thing. So sit back, listen and enjoy, and make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Please share it with your friends and colleagues, and you can always check out our two websites that cover all of this: Energy Live News and futurenetzero.com. This podcast is purely editorial, so sit back and enjoy this week's episode. Now, on the podcast, over the years, we've talked about money, we've talked about finance, we've talked about science. And one of the things that we are looking at in this transition is actually probably something we don't even know yet. New technologies that could speed things up. If you look at what's been going on in net zero, perhaps going back to 2019 when the Tory government, although it's my backtracked a bit, put into law the net zero target, I don't think fusion was on anyone's radar. But now we're funding fusion. Carbon capture's been around a long time, but didn't get anywhere. Now it's being funded globally. What are the technologies in the future that will help us to get to net zero in the next kind of 25 years? And one of the areas we want to explore today on the podcast is all about, whether you call it carbon removals, carbon sequestration, doesn't matter, getting carbon out. So all the crap we're pumping out, how do we get rid of it? Well, I'm joined today by a man with two hats. He told me, 2 jobs, 2 hats. A man who was a financier, still is, and a man who's got a love of science. Mr. Stig Arf, thank you very much for joining me. And you run something called the Carbon Technology Research Foundation, Stig. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, as a man of money, why the hell are you getting involved in science where people lose a lot of money?
Well, that's easy to answer because I've been aware of the problem of climate change ever since I studied many years ago. So that's the main reason. Once I came into the money, this was a huge opportunity for me to try to deal with something that's been on my mind for the past 40 years. But there is the addition is that it's great fun.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I'm really enjoying this, and I think that has to be the basis for all endeavors like this.
Absolutely. I wouldn't do this podcast unless I laughed, generally. But in terms of kind of your background, just before we go into what you're doing with the CTRF, let's call it that because it's very long for me to say.
It's a mouthful, isn't it? Yeah.
It is. So are you being Norwegian, is that right?
I am a Norwegian, yes.
Right. So we know that Norwegian, the Scandies, as we call you, you're always very eco. You drive Volvos, you like wood, you live in lovely log cabins, you've always been protect the planet, you go around on bicycles. All of these are piss takes, but you're seen to be people who like sustainability before sustainability was even a big thing. So going back to your youth, did you grow up more sort of environmentally aware, do you think, than sort of other people in Europe?
I'm afraid I have to disappoint you, Summit. Yeah, I grew up abroad because my parents were in the Foreign Service.
Oh, I see.
So in a way, I mean, you touched upon something because that could be one of the driving forces, that you have a global perspective and are culturally diverse in a way in terms of your experience, I think. So your question was good, but it got another answer than you were expecting.
Where did you grow up then? What sort of parts of the world?
I grew up in Central Europe, in Turkey, in Athens, London even. So all over the place.
Well, you definitely remember the pollution in London then.
Well, it's not that long ago. Come on. That was in the 50s, Simon.
I know, it was pretty bad in the 80s when I was knocking around. So, yeah. So in terms of your background, you made your money in finance. When did this idea of setting up this centre come to fruition? Because it's been going about 3 years, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
So it doesn't take a second to turn these things around. It takes a lot of while. So when did you start thinking you wanted to do something in this space?
Well, the timing was horrible because I sold the fintech company that I was running end of 2019.
Oh,
And then,
right.
of course, the pandemic hit.
Yeah.
So I thought it was an opportune time to, do all the office work connected to establishing a company in the UK, in Oxford, in fact. It turned out to be a much harder process than I originally anticipated. Well, the hardest thing, and it sounds incredible, was to establish a bank account. So that was in a way the tipping point. You couldn't do
That's not
anything
great for a
before.
financier, is it
Yeah, no,
really?
it isn't. Yeah, and the reason is because everybody was applying for grants from the government
Yeah.
at that time. I mean, in the UK and everywhere else. So the banks were bogged down in, I don't know, a million applications for financing,
Yeah.
and anything that came from the outside, they just threw into the dustbin, basically. So that took me about a year and a half to just do those very basic things. And then, of course, you couldn't meet people in person, so hiring a CEO was a challenge as well. So I went to London end of 21 with a risk hanging over me that if I just coughed or anything, and then I would be quarantined, sorry, in London.
Yes.
But no, it worked out okay. So we played with fire, but we survived.
Where did the idea come from? So you said obviously clearly you were selling your business and you were going to build this center. But where did that idea come from? Because clearly you couldn't have just thought, right, today I finish my fintech, tomorrow I'm creating this kind of carbon biotech company.
Yeah, I've been driven by climate change ever since my studies. So I'm actually my first degree was as a physicist,
Right.
and there's been a lot of things going on in the area of science and new technologies, and I thought in a way this was perfect timing because I'm probably going to maybe speak about this in a couple of minutes, but everything that's going on in the biotech sector were really it enthused me, it made me really inspired, it motivated me. That is probably where the solution lies in terms of the net zero transition. And then the idea to finance research and to do
Yeah.
that in Oxford Oxford is a brand basically, and that was my thinking at the time. If you've got the Oxford brand behind you, it's easier to get access, open doors, etc., etc.
So it's called the Carbon Technology Research Foundation. For my audience, what does it do? There's tons of research into carbon all the time. So what are you doing that's new?
Well, this might come as a surprise. We are financing research based on biotechnology.
Okay.
And the surprise here is that it's extremely underfunded, which was also something that inspired me because, my thinking was go where the money isn't, because that's where you're going to make most impact, right?
Right.
Um, and there's been so much going on in the biotech sector. It's all started off with, mapping of the genome
Yeah.
5 years ago. It cost $1 billion approximately at that point in time.
I
Now,
remember it well.
now it's the price of a beer, right? So
Mm.
it's incredible what development there's been.
The Human Genome Project. Yeah, I remember
Yeah,
reporting on
exactly.
it. Yeah.
So that's I think what's kick-started it all, because then you had a complete overview of everything that drives life in a way. The next step was, of course, gene editing.
Yeah.
The Nobel Prize was in 2016, and that's made a huge impact in many different areas, especially health and
Yes.
agriculture, I would say. And then we had last year, you had another Nobel Prize within synthetic biology, and not to forget AI.
Of
Now,
course.
those three things in company have made an enormous impact on how research is done and the speed in which we can do research and how we can accelerate it. And the great thing about AI is we all, we've become acquainted with it. We've been impressed by it, what it can do. So it's really easy to, in a way, think of a parallel in research, because research is it's a complex thing. It's also a trial and error thing. Traditionally, research is trial and error, doing things
Yeah.
again and again and again. And it's a huge space that you have to investigate in order to come up with a solution, which is what AI can accelerate. So it can do a lot of that, groundwork for you, so you can concentrate on the promising branches, if you will.
Biotechnology, for people who don't sort of know, in a simple way, what would you say it is, to explain it? Because you've talked about, people have heard of like gene testing, people may have heard of all these things, and people have heard, a few years ago, people heard about genetically modified crops. But it means a lot of things to a lot of people. So how would you summarize the term biotechnology?
I would very simply, I would say it's tinkering with nature, basically, and you're tinkering with how life is programmed. So you can make a parallel to system developers, and you can change a bit of the program and thus change the properties of that program. And that is what we're trying to do. We're trying to take properties from life, which is very apt in terms of carbon sequestering,
Yeah.
and then reproducing that property in other organisms. Now, why would we want to do that? Because in order to capture enough carbon, you need huge biomass, basically. We're talking about, I don't know, numbers that probably could be, I guess, confusing people, but currently we're emitting 35 gigatons of carbon every year.
Right.
The nature or the biosphere in which we live has a turnover of 350. So that's 10 times the amount that we're releasing. So, it's really a simple back of the envelope calculation. If you can improve the turnover by 10%, you've solved the problem
Of course.
on an envelope, that is. So
Yeah.
there's still some work to be done. But I think that's the only game in town, really, if you want to really have an impact in terms of carbon capture.
Because the thing is, the carbon capture, which I mentioned at the beginning of the intro, it's all very chemistry and physics, isn't it? It's basically you capture it, and then it's a machine, and it's an absorption material. Maybe there's carbon fibers.
Yeah.
Who knows? People are working on various different things, but they all work the same way. Whether it's direct air capture, suck it in, or
Yeah.
whether it's kind of doing it that way, and then you pump it into. They use a couple
Sure.
of chemicals, and you
Yeah.
pump it underground.
Yeah.
When you talk about biological sequestration, most people will probably think of, I don't know, moss, peat, things like that, or soil. We've done stories of people using soil, and certain elements of organic and inorganic in soil can attract carbon. But what sort of things are living right now that are hoovering up carbon that we could use more creatively, do you think?
I'm thinking of very small things like
Bacteria?
bacteria and single cell organisms.
Right.
I'm
Because otherwise
thinking,
people always think of planting, don't they? They go, let's plant 1 billion trees, and that's it.
yeah,
Job down.
yeah. So this is something else, because trees take a long time to grow.
Yeah.
They take 30, 40 years to grow up in, basically. So carbon capture takes a long time. So that's one aspect of it. But the biomass is really linked to single cell organisms.
Yeah.
And everywhere, but specifically in the oceans. So you got billions of tons of bacteria at the very bottom of the chain.
Yeah.
And that's where we're doing the brunt of our work. So, for example, there are bacteria that eat methane. So one of our projects deals with that, which would give very immediate results as well, because methane is 30 to 80 times more potent than CO2. So that's quite technical, but this has actually reached field trial stages. There's a field trial going on in the US in May, and the project's only been going on for 2 years, so we're really excited about that. But it can't be one single solution. It's a collection of many, which is why we have to do a pursuit in parallel with many, many research projects going on at the same time.
I mean, it's really interesting. I got a little one who's reading a book in the oceans, and it was very clever because it just had a very simple thing. It showed about algae, right, which you're talking about, sort of blue-green algae and things like that, and the algae that live in the sea. And basically, most of the oxygen on the planet is coming from them rather than the trees. And we have an idea that we don't look at the water and we don't look at little things, even though they make up the most biomass. You talked about that, which sounds really exciting. But what other things could there be? Are we looking at funguses, or is it all going to be kind of the small single cell type creatures that are lurking in places that we don't normally look?
It's going to be creatures where there is a very large biomass. I think
Right.
that's the simple answer to that. But it's not simple to understand in any way because these are creatures that we don't see normally.
Yeah.
But that is where the biomass is. But the good thing about these small creatures is they're very easy to do research on because they have, the generational life is, hours or days or weeks, but not months or years.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned forests, for example, which means that you can pursue, or accelerate your research in terms of looking at other organisms. So it's got all these good aspects to it, these small organisms they won't find. So fungi, for example, yes, they're everywhere.
Yeah.
We could look at fungi, but we're primarily looking at, organisms where you have photosynthesis, because that is where the carbon is captured, basically.
Listening to this, people go, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, Steve! You're doing some tinkering, doctor genetics, right?"
Yeah.
And this is where the thing is, people can have a very emotive reaction when you clone a sheep, right? They see that. But the tiny things, they really matter. What are you doing to make sure that when you start tinkering with these things, you don't create some sort of abomination that's
Yeah.
out there?
It's a very good question. Right now, we're not doing anything because there's nothing to investigate in a way or model to see what the impact on the environment is.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of being the mad professor. I'm just saying this is the way to go, and then I'll leave it to others to do the evaluation of this. What's the impact on nature, etc. Because I have a host of very clever people being able to do ecological modeling, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
But when I speak to the researchers, I guess in many ways they're mad professors as well. They're not very concerned because they're saying, okay, we're taking this bacteria,
Yeah.
we're taking a property from another bacteria or single cell organism, which means it can assimilate 50% more carbon. Otherwise, it's just going to go on with life as it has.
Right.
So they're not overly concerned, but you obviously have to address this because it will be, people will be concerned about this, and we have to
Yeah, of
address the
course.
concerns.
But the idea is that when they absorb this, say you take a bug, right? So we find a bug, let's call it Stigus carbonus, right? It lives in the bottom of the sea. You find
Yeah.
it, you find that it can absorb carbon very easily. It's obviously built to absorb carbon down there in the ocean, right? Say the seafloor. How the hell is it going to help us with the stuff we're pumping up in the sky? So is it that you could bring those bacteria to the surface? Do you grow them in pools? I know the science is very early days, but you see what I'm trying to say? You've got them in one environment. How do you get them, although the ocean does absorb carbon, how do you get them to where it's actually there? It start to affect what we see being pumped out.
Well, this is the great thing because we're not moving them anywhere. We're just going to do that where they are.
Right.
And that is, there are several positives about that. One is, none of us are paying nature for anything currently. So it's basically free. If the researchers will take some, investment.
Yeah.
And there will be some applications, I think you're probably thinking of that, where there would be, let's say, bioreactors that you would have to replicate across the world.
Yeah.
But if it's in the oceans, if it's in the air, if it's on land, you can basically just let things be. But with organisms that do the same thing that they used to do, but capture more carbon.
The thing is, how do you prove all of this? And I know this is the science that you're funding now in these projects. And I think you said earlier before we started recording, you've got 3 projects going. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Are they all looking at bacteria at present?
Yeah. Well, one is looking at algae as well,
As algae as well. Right,
but
okay.
that's approximately the same thing.
So the big question would be, very simply, okay, thank you, Stig. You've created these bacteria that are more efficient. How can you prove it? You know, are you going to have to? How can you prove how much it's absorbed? And once it's absorbed it, what does it do with it? Is it just make more of these bacteria, and that's how the carbon is used as just a form of life, or do these things put something back, make something out of it?
Yeah, yeah. I think proving it is not that difficult. You can prove it in the lab, basically, because they're looking for strains of bacteria that have those properties, and they will function in the lab as they will outside the lab. They're they're very resilient organisms. These small. Regarding I think your next question is very interesting because how do you ensure that it's not going back into the atmosphere?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
And there's several ways around it. The most elegant way is if we could reverse the process that made the fossil fuel in the first place. To
right.
have organisms in the ocean which you could modify both in terms of their ability to capture carbon, but also in their ability to sink to the bottom of the ocean floor. So you've got often they will be encapsulated in silicon, which gives them some weight, and they will drift slowly to the ocean floor. This is one possible way, but drifting sounds slow, and it is. So the other one is to capture the bacteria themselves and
Yeah,
then turn it into something called biochar, which is basically a very stable form of carbon, so it won't be
yeah.
released into the
We've
atmosphere.
covered that biochar. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, great. So there's several options, but the long-term option is to replicate what's going on in the ecosystem today.
So, in essence, do you think if you can crack the science, and as you said, the idea of your foundation is you fund the science, then hopefully they become commercial models and people take them on. But do you think that this, I mean, potentially, it's much more cost effective than building big carbon capture plants because there's no concrete, there's no steel, there's no one of that. It's just naturally occurring organisms. So
Exactly.
why are we not doing much more of this?
Well, I'm asking myself the same question. I think it's catching on. There are some indications. There's more and more going on, more and more chatter about this. Um, in terms of financing, I think it's partly due to philanthropy waking up to what they can step up to do, rather than put everything into great causes like humanitarian causes,
Yeah.
equality, societal stuff, which we still need to do. They can invest more into this area. I'm not saying this is the only one. There could be others. What's called a kind of a systemic investment, if you will, rather than in people and charities. And as I said, we're going to do both. But right now, I actually have the figures that about 5 billion going into climate from private, individuals,
Right.
philanthropists, and like, and only it's less than 50 million going into CDR, which is carbon dioxide removal. So it's hugely underfunded,
Mm.
and I'm amazed by this fact. But come to think of it, I'm a latecomer as well, right? I just started this 3 years ago, so I can't really point the finger at anyone except myself, I guess. So in a way, I have a job to do to convince like-minded people that they should get into this as well.
Let's just end with you've got 3 projects going, and I know it's the research center is based in Oxford, but it's around the world, right? So one you mentioned in America is doing what? Did you say?
Probably you're thinking of the methane capture problem. Yeah, so there's actually bacteria that love methane.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, doesn't sound very appetizing, but they do. And we're pursuing a new strain of methane bacteria that can thrive on low concentrations of methane.
Right.
There's methane in the air. It's you can barely sense it. It's the concentration is way much lower than CO2, for example. And when if you they will leave that, but due to the low concentration, they will die. So
Gotcha.
you've got a non-sustainable system. So the idea is to bring them down to that level that is required to make them more resilient. And this is something that's been going on in agriculture for the last 10 years with gene editing. You've made plants, etc., that are more resilient to
Yes.
their environment. Like droughts, for example,
Yeah.
or environmental problems, that kind of thing. So the idea is to do that to methane bacteria instead. So there's a field trial, as I mentioned, now in May, and if that is a success,
Yeah.
then the next step will be incubation, basically.
So
Of
that's
the
one.
company.
That's one. That's a good one.
Yeah.
What else are you sort of funding right now?
Then we got one where, as I mentioned, algae are very good at sequestering carbon.
Yeah.
So we're trying to take that property from the algae and implanting them in plants, basically, but not agricultural plants. Plants that grow really fast. I'm sorry, I can't recollect what the exact plant is.
Yeah.
But you can basically just sow fields with that plant, and it'll capture them. Plus, the plant will have a root system which stores the carbon rather than it escaping back into the atmosphere.
Okay.
So that's
Cool. I like
interesting.
that. So these are supercharged plants. Good. I like
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
And is there another one?
Well, there is another one which deals with a very basic piece of photosynthesis. So this is quite theoretical. But if you can change the way photosynthesis happens, then you basically can change anything.
Well, of
But
course.
it's so basic, to all plant life. But that is more long term. So I would guess that's probably 10 to 15 years down the line. But if that happens, we've solved this. You mentioned fusion, I think, at the
Yes.
start of the program.
Yeah, I did.
So maybe this is your kind of biotech fusion. It's always 30 years in the future, right? We'll see.
Everyone says.
So we're doing both short term and long term right now, just to have a proof of concept.
I mean, I hope you don't mind saying, but you funded this yourself, haven't you, to start with?
Yes.
It's a very big thing to do, and it's a brave thing to do. What have your friends and family thought of you doing this? Because it's one thing to say, I'm going to set something up, but it's another thing to put your own money into it to back this kind of cutting edge science, which is normally done by either governments or institutions and things like that. Why are you risking your own money on it?
Well, I'm not risking all of it. I guess I don't. It's not. I don't see that as a problem really. I can get by with what's left. So I'm a bit of an evangelist, I guess, in trying to bring the message across right now. And this confluence of the different three different sciences of gene editing, AI, and synthetic biology. We're extremely lucky that has actually happened just now. I mean, as we speak, the Nobel Prize was awarded just 4 months ago.
Yeah.
For the synthetic biology, and that's going to prove itself as well as a fantastic way forward. Yeah, so I'm doing many things at the same time. One is financing the research projects to show how it can be done and the results it can produce, and the other is to spread the good news.
Do you hope that the sort of centre will eventually be run by a government? Will it be something that becomes more sort of funded by companies, for example, the companies that are watching and listening to this? Is that your aim, that you hope you start this off and it becomes something like a properly big funded international body, really?
But my feeling is that it's a bit of Silicon Valley in the 70s.
Right.
You didn't see a lot of government funding going into that. I
No,
think most politicians now, I mean, their focus is elsewhere as we speak, right?
of
So
course.
that's one problem, obviously. But even if the problem wasn't there, I don't think they would. It's kind of complicated,
And,
talking about
and it's a
it.
lot longer than 5 years, so they don't care.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be too much longer. As I said, so initially, we have a 3 to 7 month, no, sorry, year perspective
Yeah.
on most of our research projects. If they're longer than that, it'll have to wait, basically.
Well, I think you're doing some very interesting stuff, and I think the idea that people are trying to use what we've already got in nature. People are talking about natural capital and other things we've covered. I think this is a real, stark example of how you can do something which might well be a real game changer. So I wish you all the best with what you're doing there, Stig. It's very clever.
Thank you, Zermit. It was great talking to you.
No, absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. And let's hope these bacteria are out there doing their business soon because we need it.
I can hear the munching in the background already. Yeah, thank you.
No, they,
All right.
they'll want more.
Bye-bye, Zermit.
They'll want more money, mate. That's the trouble.
Yeah. All
Thank you very
right.
much, Stig.
Thank
Thank you very
you.
much indeed. So,
Bye-bye.
ladies and gentlemen, that is Stig, who runs something called the Carbon Technology Research Foundation. Check it out. You can have a look at it. I think it's very clever science. I think that science is the way. As a certain Matt Damon said, we can science the shit out of this. That's exactly the way we're going to get to where we want with net zero. And these sort of projects are great to investigate. And I'm glad we've been able to give you a little bit of publicity, hopefully, Stig, to bring this on. Let us know what you think. Get in touch on social media. Thanks to Rob for the production on this episode. See you next time on the Net Hero podcast.
You've just heard the Net Hero podcast from futurenetzero.com. Join us as we help you find ways to cut your carbon footprint as we head towards net zero. Subscribe and follow us on social media. futurenetzero.com. Better business, better planet.